Slachran Kani Barres, and what is the endocrine system? So, unlike the unicellular organisms, multicellular organisms, the organisms who have different organs or different systems, they need to have a sophisticated system to coordinate the function of different organs. Therefore, they need an efficient integrated system to coordinate different functioning using electrical or chemical signals. So in mammals, we have two main systems which are responsible for to achieve this coordination. The first one is the central nervous system, and the second one is the endocrine system. So the central nervous system can regulate the function of different organs and different structures through two main regulatory pathways. The first one is directly through the electrical signals, and the second one is through releasing some neurotransmitters which have a role in the coordination of the function of different structures. So endocrine system is mainly responsible for the regulation of the function of the organ through releasing of chemical signals or chemical messages or hormones. So our focus will be, or we are trying to focus on the function of the endocrine system, and we will explain the structural and functional components of this system. يعني بە شێوەیەکی گشتی لە ئەو ئۆرگانیزمانی کە خانێ لەشیان لە چەند ئۆرگانێکە خانێک چەند سیستەمێک دروست بووە پێویستیان بەوە هەیە کە چەند سیستەمێکی تایبەتیان هەبێت کە ریگولیشنی ئەم فەنکشنی ئەم ئۆرگانە ئەم سیستەمە جیاوازانە پێکەوە بەسێتەوە کە ئەمەش پێی ئەوترێت کە ئەمەش لە دوو سیستەما خۆی بینێتەوە یەکەمیان پێوتێکی نەرڤەس سیستەم و دووهەمیان چیە ئەندۆکراین سیستەمە. نرڤس سیستم ئەم ڕێمە باس ناکەین تاوان ڕێکخراوی فەنکشنی سێڵ یا بۆمونە ئۆرگانێک لەلانی سیستەمە لە ڕێگەی یا ئلیکتریکال سیگناڵە بێت یان لە ڕێگەی چێ بێت نیورۆ ترانسمیتەرەوە ئەبێت کە ئیفراز دەبێت و فەنکشنەکانی خۆ ڕێکەخات. بەڵام لە ئیندۆکراین سیستەم ئەم سیستەمیان لە چەند گلاندی جیاواز دروست بۆ تەبان بڵاو بۆت بۆ ناو لەشا و زیاتر فەنکشنی هەر ئۆرگانێکیان سێڵێکا سێکچێ لە ڕێگەی ڕێگەخن لە ڕێگەی ئیفرازکردنی کیمیکەڵ ماتریێڵێک کە پێ ئەوترێت کە پێ دەوترێتی هۆرمۆن. So the endocrine system is an integrated network of multiple glands. If you have a look here, what we have different types of endocrine glands that release they release a specific agent which is called hormone. So the hormones are responsible for the coordination and integration of cellular activities by regulating a specific function and homeostasis. So the endocrine system made of three main basic components, which include the endocrine glands, and then what we have the hormone, the chemical agent which is released by the gland to coordinate the function of a structure or an organ or a cell. And what we have a target cell. So we have a target organ or target cell. This is the organ where the hormone can bind and induce its activities. Okay. يعني endocrine system چییە؟ يعني لە کۆمەڵ نێتوەرکێک لە کۆمەڵە گلاند دروست بوو. ئەم گلاندانە فەنکشنەکان ئەوەیە کە هۆرمۆن دروستەکەن و هۆرمۆنیش کە دروستە بێت فەنکشنی ئۆرگانێک یا سێکچرێکیان سیستەمێک چیەکات ڕێکەخا و endocrine system لە سێ بەشی سەرەکی پێکەیە کەمیان چیمان هەیە we need to have an endocrine gland you need to have a gland to regulate the function of to produce a hormone. And then what we have a hormone which is released by the glands, and we have a target cell or target organ. It is the organ or the system or the structure where the hormone can induce it as. So what we said the endocrine system is made of what of endocrine gland, hormone, and target organ or target cell. So what is the endocrine gland? The endocrine gland are ductless glands. So in our body we have two types of glands. The first one is called exocrine gland, and the second group are or of glands are called the endocrine glands. The exocrine glands can be differentiated from that of the endocrine glands by having ducts, but endocrine glands they are ductless. They don't have any ducts. They directly secrete their the products or their hormones into the interstitial tissue, the tissues are surrounding the gland, and then from the tissues they can directly enter into the circulatory system and get to the organs where they can induce a specific function, which are so the endocrine glands are scattered throughout the body. They secrete a specific chemical agent which is called or recognized as a hormone into the interstitial space, as we mentioned before. If you have a look here, what we have, this is referring to a gland. So they produce a hormone. They secrete it into the interstitial tissue, and from the interstitial tissue they can enter into the circulatory system, and then through the circulatory system they can get into the target tissue or cells. So when they get into the target tissue and cell, they can directly bind to their own specific receptors, and they can induce a specific biological action. If you have a look at this two type of the cells, this cell also have a receptor, but has a receptor, but it is not a hormone specific receptor, or it might be related to another type of the hormone or another group of the hormone. So this one is a target cell. يعني endocrine gland أوي كدكتيان نية ولقل exocrine أبو جاكته كأوان دكتيان هي أمان دكتيان نية ودواء أو فانكشنيان أوي كهرمون دروسة كان هرمون كدروسة بس دوري interstitial tissue كدوري gland كان دا وليو diffuse بيبو ناو blood لرجع blood وأجاتك فيه قاعد target organ يعني أو يعني السلاني كواتشين كتارجت كرسبتي تايبت يعني هي بوشي بو أو هرمون أما بون منا سيلة كرسبتي هي بلان بوشينية بو أم هرمونني لبل أول شيء كانت وانا باندينا. Then what are hormones? Hormones are chemical messengers that are released mainly by specific cell or organs of the body to perform a biological action on target cells. So in our body, sometimes we have, like, let us say, some specific cells which are responsible for releasing of a chemical messenger for releasing of a hormone. Let us say such as adipocytes. Adipocytes sometimes they can release some factors or some signals, and they can regulate the function of, let us say, another structure or another organ. Okay, so in general what we have, the hormones can be classified into three main groups. The first group is called the endocrine hormones. The endocrine hormones, as we mentioned before, this type of hormone is produced by endocrine glands and released into the circulatory system, and from the circulatory system they can get to they can produce an effect on a distant target organ. So they can enter into the blood, and through the blood they can get to the different locations in our body, and they can induce the function of a specific function in a distant target organ. while the second group of the hormones are called the paracrine hormones. If you have a look here, what we have, the chemical messengers that only act on the cells in the immediate vicinity of the cells from which they are released, or they can act on the neighboring cells. So the hormone is produced by this cell, and then they can act on the adjacent cells, the cells which are the nearby cells. Okay, so, this type of the hormone is called is called the paracrine. It's para, it means adjacent or parallel or neighboring cells. Okay, so this third group of the endocrine hormone, sorry, of the hormone, is called the autocrine hormones. So the chemical let us say agent which is produced by a cell and acted on the same cell. So it is produced let us say a specific type of cell in our body, and they can uh, directly bind to a specific receptor on the same cell. So it can induce the function of the cell which is responsible for the production of the hormone. يعني بشوية عام بدمن هرمون سيرجوري هي كمان بيوتي اندوكراين هرمون كإفراز بيتا لرقي بلدوا دروس بلا اندوكراين جلاند لرقي بلدوا قاعدة كي قاعدة أوسيلانية أو أورجانيكا لش دورن لا أورجانيكا يعني فانكشن كان لدوري أورجانيكا جلاندكا دو هم جروب يعني بيامتيت باراكراين بارا يعني أجلس يعني نزيكي يعني سلالي سێڵێک ئەو دروستە بێت لە فانکشنەکەی لە سێڵەکەی تەنیشتی خۆیەتی یا لە ئۆرگانیەکەی تەنیشتی خۆیەتی کەواتە ئەمە چی ئەمە پێوتێت پاراکراین. دوایەوە چیمان هەیە ئۆتۆکراین هۆرمۆنمانێ ئۆتۆکراین ئۆتۆمینز the same cell ینی چێکات ینی لەسەر خۆی ئیشەکات ینی هۆرمۆنەکە کە خۆی دروستیەکات و فانکشنی هۆرمۆنەکەشی لەسەر هەمان سێڵە ئەمە پێوتێت چی پێوتێت ئۆتۆکراین. So based on their chemical structures or structural components, the hormones can be divided also into three main groups. The first group are recognized as protein or peptide hormones. So for production of a protein or peptide hormone, we need to have a specific gene in our body. Okay, so we have a gene which is responsible for the production of this hormone. Then the gene can be, or the DNA or the gene can be expressed into messenger RNA, and then messenger RNA can be translated into a peptide or a protein or a polypeptide hormone. Polypeptide is a sequence of amino acids which are connected by the peptide bonds. So the as we mentioned here, for every protein in our body, we should have have a specific gene, and this gene can be translated into a protein or polypeptides with the aid of ribosomes. Okay, so then when they are produced, they can be stored in the form within vesicles within the cells. So when they are needed, they can be released into the peripheral tissues and then into the circulatory system with the aid of but in a process which is called exocytosis. So the peptide or protein or let us say or the hormone which are made of protein or peptides, they can be stored within the cell and they can be released when they are required, such as insulin. Okay, so this second group of hormones are called steroid hormones. The backbone of the steroid hormones is made of cholesterol. This is the structure of cholesterol. So The steroid hormone is, or the backbone of the steroid hormone is made of what? Of cholesterol. So if you have a look here, what we have, this hormone is called cortisol, which has a specific function. And we have another hormone which is called aldosterone, which is also a steroid hormone. So the backbone of these hormones are made of what? Of cholesterol. And if you have a look here, what we have, this is testosterone, okay, a male sex hormone, and this one is the estradiol or estrogen, which is a female hormone. So if you have a look at the structure of these two hormones, there is a minor differences between them, but in the term of physiological action, they induce uh, quite different uh, physiological actions, or they have a different, let us say, they have different functions in our body. They can induce, let us say, different functions in our body. So the third group of the hormones are called, recognized as amino acid derived hormone. So the amino acid derived hormone, they are produced of a single amino acid, and tyrosine is the common amino acid which can be used as a backbone for the production of the amino acid derived hormones. So a single, let us say, tyrosine is going through a different structural and chemical changes, and they, at the end of the day, they can produce a specific hormone in our body, and they can produce a specific function. يعني لە ڕێگەی هۆرمۆنەکان بە شێوەی سترەکچەرشی پێکاتی کیمیانە سێ جۆرن، ئەوانەی کە پرۆتین و پێپتایدن، ئەوانەی کە ستیرۆید هۆرمۆنی، ئەوانەی کە ئەمینۆ ئەسید درایڤد هۆرمۆنن. پرۆتین یان پێپتاید هۆرمۆنەکان پێویستەکە جینێکمان هەبێت کە دروستیان بکا و جینەکە بێتە mRNA لە DNA و دوایەوە لەسەر رایبۆسۆم ئەکسپرێس هەبێت لە شێوەی ڤیزیکڵا کۆ بێتەوە ناو سێڵەکە و هەر کات پێویست بێت ئیفرازەکەیتە دەرەوە. ستیرۆید هۆرمۆنەکان ئەگەر سیریان بکەی هەموو پێکاتی سەرەکییان بریتیە بێت لە چی؟ لە کۆلسترۆڵ، و ئەم هەرێکێک لە ئەمانە فەنکشنێکی جیاوازیان هەیە، بۆ لە کۆرتیزۆڵ جیاواز دوای باسییانەکەی لە ئەڵدۆستیرۆن جیاوازی دوسترادایۆڵ و لە تێستۆستیرۆن. بەڵام ئەمینۆ ئەسید درایڤد هۆرمۆن ئەمینۆ ئەسیدێکت تاکت هەیە، ینی سنگڵ ئەمینۆ ئەسید، چی ئەبێت؟ مۆدیفیکیشنی بەسەر، یان کیمیکاڵ چێنجی بەسەرێت و ئەبێتە چی؟ بێتە هۆی ئەوەی کە وەکو هۆرمۆن ڕۆڵی هەبێت لە چیا؟ لە لەش. So the third compartment of the endocrine system is the target organ. So the target organ contains cell-specific receptors. If you have a look at this structure, or the cell, it is considered as a target organ. Why? Because it has hormone-specific receptors which make them respond upon its binding. Okay, so this cell is not a target organ because it doesn't have let us say, a specific receptor for this hormone. So, but this one is the target cell. Why? Because it has a specific receptor for this hormone. So this hormone, it can directly bind with the receptor and induce a specific function within the cell. Target organ أو سيلة يعني أو أورجانيكا هرمونك الريسبتي تايبتي خوي هي لسري وكاتك بي إجا يصير بايندين لقاتو induce function كات وهمو أو يعني يمد جوي جازي الريسبتر مان هي للشة وهر هرمونك ريسبتي تايبتي خوي هي. So normally the hormone receptors are made of protein molecules. They receive, let us say, signals. So the hormone receptors interaction leads to induction of a specific form of biological response within the cell. Okay, so the hormone receptors are characterized by two main features. The first one is the high affinity, and then the second one is the specificity for let us say a specific hormone. So high affinity, it means when the hormone came near to the receptor, it can directly recognize it and bind to it. Okay, so specificity. So it means the hormone or the receptor can differentiate between different types of the hormones and only can bind with it is own specific hormone. So these are the properties of receptors. Normally, we have two main types of receptors. The first one is called the cell membrane receptor, and the second one is called the intracellular receptors. The cell membrane receptors are located on the surface of the target cells, like this one, while the intracellular receptors are located within the cytoplasm of the cell or within the nucleus of the cell. So the hormone needs to pass through the phosphate bilayer, lipid bilayer of the cell membrane, and it should get to the cytoplasm or the nucleus of the cell to bind with the intracellular receptors. But for the extracellular receptors, the hormones can directly bind to the receptor on the surface of the cell. Okay? يعني اما هورمون بشوتي گشتي دو جور مان هي هورمون بلند ريسبتور وهر ريسبتور يا اوتاني سيل ممبرين ريسبتور كلا سيرفيسي سيلكي سر روكش دروي سيلكي باندين لگل اگا فانكشنكي با ترانزاكشن اتشد ناو سيلكا و انتراسيلولر ريسبتور او كز ريسبتور يا ناو سيتوبلازم يا ناو نيوكليوس سيلكي هورمونكي بيسكات ام سيل ممبرين ببري بوي بانديني لگل كا و اندوسي فانكشن بكا لشي لا لناو سيلكا و بو همو ريسبتور كيز دو بروبرتي گرنگا يعني كمان هاي افينيتيا يعني توانایەکی ڕادەبەدلی هەیە بۆچی بۆ باینین لەگەڵ ئەو هۆرمۆنەی کە هی خۆیەتی و سپسیفیستی ینی ئەتوانێت جیازی بکات لە بینی ئەو هۆرمۆنی کە بۆ ڕسپتەکەی لە نێوانچی لە ناو سەدان هەزار هۆرمۆنی ترا و دوایەوە بەس باینین لەگەڵ چی بکات لەگەڵ ئەو هۆرمۆنە بکات کە سپسیفیکە بۆ خۆی تایبەتە بۆ ڕسپتەرەکە. So generally, what we have the endocrine glands or the abnormality of the endocrine glands might be related to one of these defects. The first one, either we have a high amount or insufficient high amount or insufficient amount of a specific hormone. If you have, let us say, half amount of a specific hormone might lead to what? Lead to an abnormal condition like excessive growth, okay? Or when we have insufficient amount of the hormone within the body, so it might lead to what? Lead to another an abnormality, such as the pituitary dwarfism. The height of the person is not normal. So this is the first one, high amount or insufficient amount of a specific hormone. The second abnormality or the second cause of the endocrine abnormality might be related to what? To the decreased receptor number or function. So such as in the case of type 2 diabetic mellitus, the receptors or has no the ability to bind with the insulin, or we don't have, let us say, sufficient amount of the receptor on our cells to be inducing. So in either cases, the decreased receptor number or their function might lead to what? Lead to an endocrine gland abnormality. Okay, so this is the most common causes of the abnormal endocrine function. Okay, يعني بشوية عام دو هوكاي سريكي هي بوي كاندوكراين abnormality لش دربك كمان أوتاني يعني أوتاني كمية أو هرموني إفراز بيز لحد خوي زيادة يا أوتاني وكو لحد بيوستان يعني قد حد زور بوكو حالة اللي دوسة بزور قشة بول لحالتي growth هرمون قشة زوره بي ما بس تايبت بو growth هرمون یا وتانه آنتریشی کم بود بهتر هوی که قزمی دروز بکرد و لحالتی growth هرمون رو داد و دووهەم هۆکار کە ئەندۆکراین سیستەم بێتە هۆی ئەڕۆناتی دروستکە بێتێ لە چی decreased receptor number or function واتە یان ریسپتەر نمبەری ریسپتەرەکان کەمێ بێتەوە یان فانکشنەکەیان تێکەچێ بەهۆی چەنجێک لە سترەکچەریان و لە ئەم حاڵەتە وەکو لە حاڵەتی تایپ 2 دیابێتیک مەلیتۆسا کە هەمانەکە ئەوترێت نسبەی نمبەری ریسپتەرەکان چی بێتەوە کەمە بێ یاوتانێ ریسپۆنسی ریسپتەرەکان بۆ ئینسۆلین کەمە بێتەوە و بە ئەم دوو حاڵەتە بێتە هۆی چی بێتە هۆی ئەوەی کە endocrine function abnormality دروست. Regulation of hormone secretion. So hormones are secreted by endocrine gland cells in response to what? To a specific stimulus. So we have a specific, for instance, there is an increase in the level of sugar in our body. This leads to what? The release of what? Of insulin from the beta cells of pancreas. So the level of the sugar can act as a stimulus. And these stimuli are the information used by the cell to increase or decrease secretion of their own hormone. Okay, when there is a reduction in the level of glucose in the circulatory system, which is followed by what? By the reduction in the level of what? Of insulin released by the beta cells. So the increase or decrease in the level of glucose can act as a inhibitory factor or stimulatory factor to decrease or increase the level of insulin. So for the other hormones, this phenomenon is the same. يعني هماش الرؤدات let us say in the case during nursing of a baby, so the level of what of prolactin is increased in the body. So this nursing can act as a trigger to increase the secretion of what of prolactin. So for the other hormones, this stimulus, or we should have a stimulus to increase or decrease the secretion of a specific hormone. In our body, we have two main mechanisms. The first one is called the negative feedback mechanism, and the second one is called the positive feedback mechanism. The negative feedback mechanism is the most common way of controlling hormonal secretion in the body. So negative feedback mechanism is the most common mechanism which can be used to regulate the function of the endocrine system. When the hormone brings about its effect, its secretion is inhibited by a mechanism which is called what? Called negative feedback mechanism. And the second pathway is a positive feedback mechanism. In a few instances, it is not very common. In few instances, positive feedback mechanism might happen. Okay, the response to the feedback amplify the original signal and increase the overall response to the stimulus. For especially we have this type of the regulation in some instances, such as the secretion of what of luteinizing hormone during the process of ovulation. So when ovulation is near to happen, the level of the luteinizing hormone should increase in a sharp manner. So this leads to what? To rupturing of the Gravian follicle and release of the ovum into the fallopian tube. So the positive feedback mechanism, as we mentioned here, it can be seen in a few instances. يعني دو جور لميكانيزمان هي بور رخصني ريليزي هرمون يا تاني نيجاتيف فيدباك ميكانيزما يا تاني بوزيتيف فيدباك ميكانيزما و او هو كاري كبته هو افراز هرمونيك زياد كا بي او تي اتش بي او تي ستيمولس و شيء بته هو كيميكاتو كو انهبيتريك رولي هي بور ريليزي بور ديكريسي ريليزي هرمونكا نيجاتيف فيدباك ميكانيزم باوترين رجي رخصني ريليزي هرمون لهلاشا وكاتك هرمونك فانكشنكي خوي اكاد با نيجاتيف فيدباك ميكانيزم شبيت انهبيشني بوكري كاد يجاش اللي يفضل خوي حد خوي لان بوزيتيف فيدباك ميكانيزم حالتي زور كم همانه بمشي وبيت اما شلون رؤدات كاتك اللي يفضل هرمونك زياده كاد بيته هوي اوي بە پۆزیتیو فیدبانکە بێتە هۆی ئەوەی کە لە باتیەوەی لێڤڵەکەی کەم بێتەوە چی بێتەوە زیاتر ئیفرازە بێت ینی هۆرمۆنەکە لێڤڵەکەی زیاترەکە ئەمە بچێ کاتیانی لە پۆزیتیڤە ینی ئیفرازی هۆرمۆنەکە چی بێت زیاترە بێت okay. So now I am trying to explain the pituitary gland. So pituitary gland is a specific gland which is hung by a short stalk or infundibula, okay, from the hypothalamus. This is hypothalamus, okay, and it is hung or suspended by a short stalk, okay. And it is enclosed by a cella turcica of the sphenoid bone. Sphenoid bone, it's a bone which is located at the base of the skull. Okay, يعني لا بشي خوالوي skull آية وشيء pituitary gland level now la sphenoid bone. So despite this small size, the pituitary gland is recognized as a master gland. So it can regulate the function of, or the vast majority of the endocrine glands can be regulated by the pituitary gland, or can be affected by the pituitary gland. So that's why it is called or recognized as the master gland. The pituitary gland can be divided into two main parts. The first one is the posterior pituitary gland, which is also called as a neurohypophysis, which is an extension of the nervous tissues of the hypothalamus. So the posterior part of the pituitary gland is a direct extension of the hypothalamus. So the nerve bodies of the posterior part of the pituitary gland are located within the hypothalamus, but their axons can extend into the pituitary gland. So the hormones are produced within the hypothalamus by the nerve cells. So then they can be sent into the end of the neurons, and then they can be stored there until they are required. And the second part of the pituitary gland is called the anterior part of the pituitary gland. So the interior part of the gland is also called adenohypophysis, so which is a separate glandular tissue. It is not directly connected to the hypothalamus. So, but its function can be regulated through the a specific arrangement of blood vessels between the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary gland. Okay, so as we mentioned before, the anterior part is not a direct extension of the hypothalamus, so it is indirectly connected to the hypothalamus, or its function can be indirectly regulated by the hypothalamus. يعني pituitary gland ki بچوكه بستالكي بچوك بسراو بچيو با hypothalamus هوا سەر ڕایەوەکە حەزمەکەی بچووکە بەڵام پێوتێ ماستەر گلاند بۆ لە بەرەوەی زۆربەی فانکشنی ئیندۆکراین گلاندەکانی لەشی ئەمە لای پituitary گلاندەوە ڕخستین بۆکرێ لە دوو بەش پێێت posterior pituitary gland ئەمە direct extension ینی ڕاستەوخۆ درێژکراوی کوێ hypothalamusە و ئەو سێڵبەدی ینی نیورۆنی ئەو ئەزانن لە چی دروست بووە لە سێڵبەدی و لە چی دروست بووە لە دندراتیک لەگەڵ یا لەگەڵ ئەگزۆنا دروست بووە سێڵبەدەکانی کەوتونەتە کەوتونە هایپۆسەڵەمەسەوە ئەو نیورۆنەی کە ئەم گلاندە دروستەکەن و ئەگزۆنەکەیشی ئەکشێتە یەتە خوارەوە بۆشێ بۆ ناو پituitary gland و ئەو هۆرمۆنەی کە دروستە بێت لە ناو هایپۆسەڵەمەس دروستە بێت و لە ڕێگەی ئەگزۆنەوە لە ئەندی ئەگزۆنەکانە لێک کۆ ئەکرێتەوە و هەر کاتێ پێویست بێت ڕیلیز ئەکرێت بەڵام بەشێکی تریەکە پێ ئەوتێت anterior part of the pituitary gland ینی ئەمەیان بە شێوەی شتی سەربەخۆ جیایە و بە شێوەیەکی ناڕاستەوخۆ لەلایەنی هایپۆسەڵەمەسەوە چێکرێت کۆنتڕۆڵەکرێت ئەویش بەڕێگەی شێوازێکی تایبەت لە چی لە بڵد ڤیزڵ بۆ نمونە ئەرێنجمنتێکی تایبەتی هەیە کە ئەتوانێت چی بکات ئەتوانێت کۆنتڕۆڵی هایپۆسەڵەمەس ئەتوانێت کۆنتڕۆڵی ئەنتریۆر پارتی پituitary گلاند بکات Hormones, as we said, the pituitary gland is made of anterior, posterior, and anterior parts. Okay, so what are the hormones of the posterior part, pituitary gland? So the posterior part of the pituitary gland produce two main types of hormones. The first one is called the antidiuretic hormone, and the second one is called oxytocin. So I think we will explain the function of the antidiuretic hormone when we get to the renal physiology. So, but you should know that antidiuretic hormone is produced by what? By the, or released by what? By the posterior part of the pituitary gland. And then the second hormone is called oxytocin, which are normally produced by hypothalamus that we mentioned before, because the cell bodies of the neurons, which is form the posterior part of the pituitary gland, are located within the hypothalamus. So they can be produced by the hypothalamus. Oxytocin, antidiuretic hormone, I meant, can be produced by what? By the hypothalamus, and they can be stored within the axon ends within the posterior part of the pituitary gland. Okay, so their release is stimulated by nerve impulses from the hypothalamus. So the signal came from, let us say, from the breast to the hypothalamus, and from the hypothalamus the signals can send to the posterior part of the pituitary gland, and they induce the release of oxytocin. Okay, it is the same for the other organs. From the kidneys, when there is a change in the water retention or water volume, or let us say blood pressure, so a signal can be sent to the hypothalamus, and from the hypothalamus they can induce the release of antidiuretic hormone into the secretory system, and through this pathway it can regulate or repair or manage the blood volume and blood pressure. Okay, so this is all about the hormones of anterior part of the pituitary gland. So what is the function of or oxytocin? Oxytocin, as we mentioned before, it is produced or secreted by what? By the posterior part of the pituitary gland. Sorry, posterior part of the pituitary gland. It stimulates the contraction of the uterus. Okay, during parturition or at the end of the pregnancy, it stimulates the contraction of the uterus, and it can push the fetus or the baby out. Okay, so the second function of the oxytocin stimulate the release of milk from the mammary glands when the baby is nursing. So when the baby is nursing, it can directly induce what? Or let us say the sensory signals from of some specific neurons which are located within the nipple of the breast can be sent into what? Into the hypothalamus, and from the hypothalamus it induces what? The release of what? Of oxytocin from the posterior part of the pituitary gland. And when the oxytocin get to the breast through the circulatory system, they can induce, look, the release of milk, not the production of milk. They can induce the release of milk from the mammary gland. Why? Because we have some myoepithelial cells which are located within the mammary gland. When the oxytocin binds to its own receptors on the myoepithelial cells, they can induce their contraction, and through this pathway they can enhance the release, or they can push the milk out of the mammary gland. Okay, so it is responsible for releasing of milk from the mammary gland. And during labor, when the cervix of the uterus is stretching, so we have some sensory neurons which are scattered throughout the cervix of the uterus, and when it is stretched, they can be induced, and they send signals to the hypothalamus, and from the hypothalamus they can release what? They can induce posterior part of the pituitary gland to release oxytocin, And when oxytocin gets to the uterus, they it induces a contraction of the uterus. So when the stretch is increasing, so the secretion of what of oxytocin from the posterior part is increasing. So this is it is acting just like a type of the positive feedback mechanism. So oxytocin causes stronger contraction of the smooth muscles of myometrium of the uterus to bring about delivery of the baby and placenta. So I think this is all about the today's lecture, and يعني ئەمە گشتی دەربارەی چی بوو دەربارەی محاضرەی ئەمڕۆ بوو لەسەر چی لەسەر پیتەری گلاند و باسی فەنکشنەکانیمان کرد و ئەگەر هات و هەر کێشەیەکە پرسیارتان هەبوو لە کاتێکی کە ئۆنلاینە بین بەلایڤ حاڵەکەین باسی بکەین. طبعا هەر بە شێوەیەکی ئام بۆی بە کوردی شەمەتان بۆ باسکەمەوە وتمان ئۆکسیتۆسین فەنکشنی یەکی لەوانە هانی چیە دەهانی کرژبوونی کۆنتراکشنی یوترەسە لە کاتی کۆتایی پریگنانسیە کاتی مناڵبوونە هانیەدا بۆ ئەوەی کە چی بێ بە ئاسایی مناڵەکە پاڵنێت بۆ دەرەوە. طبعا ئێمە لە سێرڤێکسە چیمان هەیە کۆمەڵێک سێنسەی نیورۆنمان هەیە ئەم سێنسەی نیورۆنە چێکەن سیگناڵ ئەنێرن بۆ کوێ ئەنێرن بۆ هایپۆسەڵەمەس و لە هایپۆسەڵەمەسەوە ئاکا لە پۆسیۆپاتی پێرگران چی بکەی ئۆکسیتۆزین ئیفراز بێت و کە ئیفراز دەبێت ناو سێگرێگاتە یوترس کۆنتراکشنەکە بۆ ئەوەی کە بێت کە پاتوێشن ڕوو بدات و حاڵی دووەمیان بە کاتی شیر خواردنی مناڵە لە نیپڵی برێستا چیە هەیە کۆڵێن سێنسەی نیورۆن هەیە گەن سیگناڵ ئەنێرن بۆ کوێ بۆ هایپۆسەڵەمەس دو هایپۆسەڵەمەس ئۆکسیتۆسین کە دروستە بێت ستۆرە بێ لەکوێ لە پۆسیۆپاتی پێرگلان و بەهۆی ئەم نێرسینەوە کاتی شیر خواردن ئۆکسیتۆسین ریلیز دەبێت بۆ ناو بڵەد و لە ڕێگەی بڵەد وەگاتە برێست لە برێستە تەنها فەنکشنەکەی ئەوەیە کە یارمەتی هێنانە خوارەوەی شیرەدا بۆ لەبەر ئەوەی هەنێکی سێڵی تایبەتمان هەیە لە برێستا پێوتێ مایۆ ئیپیثیلیەم ئەم مایۆ ئیپیثیلیەمانە سێڵی تایبەتین کە شێوەی سموز مەسڵیان هەیە کاتێک ئۆکسیتۆسین بەندیان لەگەڵاکە کۆنتراکشنەکەن و پاڵ بە شیرەکە ئەنێن بێتە خوار ئەمە خلاصەی تایبەت و دوای ئەوە وشمان لەبیر نەچێک هەنێ حاڵەتی تر هەیە کە بۆ نمونە we have some specific type of stimulatory factors which might induce the release of oxytocin from the posterior part of the pituitary gland, such as fear, pain, noise, and fever. Sometimes you might heard about this when a pregnant woman suffering from, like, let us say, fear or pain, or sometimes in some cases of having a high fever, might lead to the abortion or miscarriage of the baby. Okay, so again, the miscarriage of the baby as a result of pain or fear or noise or fever it might be a consequence of the releasing of oxytocin from the posterior part of the pituitary gland. يعني هنا جار بهوي بولمنا تو بيسي كأفريتكس حملي هي بهوي هو كترساوة يا بولمنا آزاري هبو يا بولمنا جاو كي زور يا لا بهوي برزبوني تاكي زور من الله كي لبالة شيء بولا بروي زور جار أم حالتانا شبته هوي شيء بته هوي أوي ك inhibitioni شيء بكات ريليزي أوكسيتوسين بكات. أوكي. سركوتو.